So, looking at Genesis 45, we looked at verse 1. Joseph couldn't control himself any longer and made himself known to his brothers. You're the one you sent me to slavery in Egypt. Tried to destroy my life. Sold me into slavery. Let's move on in 45, 2-7. How does that move on from there? He wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. The number one guy in Egypt. So Pharaoh heard of it. Then Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, Please come closer to me. And they came closer. And he said, I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. Wow. Now, do not be grieved or angry with yourselves, because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. Sovereignty of God. God sent Joseph to Egypt first, through those dire circumstances for Joseph. They were pretty dire, considering. But to preserve life, preserve his chosen people from the famine. That's the way he worked. But the circumstances within which choices were made. Notice, to be part of God's plan sometimes is not fun. Verse 6, For the famine has been in the land for 2 years, these 2 years, and there still are 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. God sent me before you to preserve you for a remnant in the earth, and to keep you alive by a great deliverance. The choices of mankind. The happenstance of the famine. The preservation of God's chosen people. Not a glorious one, is it? A dire one. Joseph being sold into slavery. We have the history of that. Go back and read about how he managed his way into the authority of number 2 man in the Egyptian Empire. Expositor's Bible Commentary. We are never told why he, Joseph, chose not to reveal his identity to his brothers immediately in the first visit, but we can see from the narrative itself that the effect of his scheme has been to further the primary themes of the book, which we'll go into. In his words of explanation and comfort to his brothers in this chapter, Joseph returned once again to the central theme of the narrative. Though the brothers were responsible for Joseph's being sold into Egypt, and though they intended harm, God was ultimately behind it all and had worked it out for the good. Actually, I would say more for conform with the purposes, the sovereign and purposes of God. Man's will, actions, circumstance, yet God's sovereignty. You go one way and you choose to go that way, you try to go against God, and all of a sudden you find that that's what God decreed in the first place. As he told his brothers it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you, verse 5, God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives. A small number of chosen ones who will grow to be God's chosen people. By the time they got out of Egypt, there were over 1 million. In the narrative thus far, this theme has been expressed by Jacob and Judah, and has also been indirectly alluded to by Joseph himself, 42:2, 43:8, 42:18. Here, however, in 50 and 20, the theme is given its full expression in the words of Joseph. Let's take a look at that. Genesis 50 and 20. As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive. Going back. So here, in Isaiah 45, as well as in 50:20, let's take a look at the passage again. This is 45:7. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant in the earth and to keep you alive by a great deliverance. 45:7. So as Joseph told his brothers, it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. And God had sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives. Verse 7. In the narrative thus far, this theme has been expressed by Jacob, Judah, Joseph himself, so it's clear. Here, however, in verse 7, as well as, see, God makes it clear by repeating himself. The theme is given its full expression in the words of Joseph. Joseph's words seem to have been in connection with God's sovereignty. So Joseph's words pull back the narrative veil and allow the reader to see what has been going on behind the scenes. How Joseph learned these things from God is not stipulated. It was not the brothers who sent Joseph to Egypt, rather it was God. And God had a purpose for it all. We have seen numerous clues throughout this narrative that this has been the case, and by the mouth of Joseph. But now the central character, the one ultimately responsible for initiating the plots and subplots of the preceding narratives, where the guilt-ridden brothers of Joseph that sold him into slavery was confronted to see if they had repented, this reveals the divine plans and purpose behind it all. Joseph, who could discern the divine plan in the dreams of Pharaoh. But how would he discern that? They also knew the divine plan in the affairs of his brothers. Through it all, he saw God's plan to accomplish a great deliverance. But through it all, can you imagine to be such a directed person by God to do such a wonderful thing, preserve the remnant of his chosen people? But what did he have to go through? To be purposed on the will of God is often suffering. Joseph explained that God had sovereignly brought him out to Egypt to prepare for their deliverance from famine. He's number two on the Egyptian, in the planet, really, number two, the Egyptian dynasty. His words form a classic statement of providential control. God sent me ahead of you. It was confirmed to that. It wasn't vague. Point B, Bible study manuals. Actually, it's Bible knowledge commentary. This was the third of 5 times he wept over his brothers. They were stunned by the news, unable to speak for fear that Joseph might kill them. He had their authority. In this passage, strong feelings and sound spiritual judgment and argument complete the work of reconciliation, which till now had called for severe testing. It had been the task for a wise man, and over an extended period of time, Joseph accomplished the task marvelously. Joseph explained that God had sovereignly brought him to Egypt to prepare for their deliverance from famine. His words form a classic statement on providential control. God sent me ahead of you. Amazing. Genesis 45:8. Now, therefore, it was not you who sent me here, but God, repeating himself, and he has made me a father to Pharaoh, and Lord of all his household, and ruler over all the land of Egypt. verse 8. Did you hear that? God has made me, Joseph, a father to Pharaoh, and Lord of all his household, and ruler over all the land of Egypt. So that God's promise to Abraham will be preserved. The descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob be preserved as God's chosen people. And we notice and see this throughout the ages. God's sovereignty working through the volition of man. Now, the volition of Israel, how godly has it been over these centuries? It's terrible. And the great persecution the Jews have experienced, which we just looked at in looking at the Palestinian area throughout the period of time before World War II and through World War II and thereafter. Anyway, Expositor says on verse 8, in describing God's care over him, Joseph made an allusion to the brothers' initial question regarding his dreams as a young lad. They had said, "Do you intend to reign over us?" Wow. Now we reminded him that he had been made ruler of all Egypt. The dreams that Joseph received. Bible Knowledge Commentary. With a burst of emotion, Joseph revealed himself to his brothers. It was not you who sent me here, but God, verse 8 and verse 9. The certainty that God's will, not man's, is the controlling reality in every event shined through as the basis for reconciliation. No doubt Joseph had consoled himself many times with this principle of faith. Boy, all by himself, sold into slavery. What's to become of me? Remember, Potter's wife took a liking to him, and he moved on. He could have lost his life then. He who is spiritual can perceive the hand of God in every event, and therefore is able to forgive those who wrong him. Somehow, Joseph saw the hand of God on him. Joseph then instructed his brothers to hurry back without delay. So, he was able to forgive them. Joseph then instructed his brothers to hurry back without delay to Jacob, his father, their father, and inform him of Joseph's power as ruler of all Egypt. Point 5, Genesis 45:9. Hurry and go up to my father, Joseph said, and say to him, thus says your son Joseph, God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not delay. Expositors, in the second part of his speech to the brothers, Joseph made plans to bring his father to Egypt. He twice repeated that the brothers would go to Jacob and with all haste bring him down to Egypt. He had set aside the region of Goshen. Bible Knowledge Commentary says, Joseph then instructed his brothers to hurry back without delay to Jacob and inform him of Joseph's power as ruler of Egypt and Lord of all Egypt and honor in all the land of Egypt. Moving on to Genesis 45:10-20. You shall live in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, you and your children, and your children's children, and your flocks, and your herds, and all that you have. Wow, they're going to prosper. There I will also provide for you, for there are still 5 years of famine to come, and you and your household, and all that you have here would be impoverished. Behold, your eyes see, and the eyes of my brother Benjamin see, that it is my mouth which is speaking to you. Now you must tell my father of all my splendor in Egypt, and all that you have seen, and you must hurry and bring my father down here. Then he fell on his brother Benjamin's neck and wept, and Benjamin wept on his neck. He kissed all his brothers and wept on them, and afterwards his brothers talked with him. Now when the news was heard in Pharaoh's house that Joseph's brothers had come, it pleased Pharaoh and his servants. Wow. Did God work in them? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, say to your brothers, do this, load your beasts and go to the land of Canaan, and take your father and your households, and come to me, and I will give you the best of the land of Egypt, and you will eat the fat of the land. Now you are ordered, do this, take wagons from the land of Egypt for your little ones and for your wives, and bring your father and come. Do not concern yourselves with your goods, for the best of all the land of Egypt is yours.